let's say I'm driving my car, I switch lanes, and this causes someone behind me to unreasonably, or for some reason, they panic, they swerve. I didn't actually cut them off, but they swerve. And this causes a big accident, someone dies, et cetera, et cetera. It is all kicked off with me changing lanes. But I wasn't aware that I was doing anything wrong. In fact, I didn't do anything wrong. I did something that led to, let's say, someone dying, but I wasn't aware that I was engaged in the kind of activity that was soon going to lead to someone dying. In that case, since I'm not aware and couldn't have reasonably been thought to be aware, expected to be aware that my changing lanes would lead to that outcome, it would be odd, it'd be weird to hold me morally responsible. It looks like I'm not morally responsible. I'm not justifiably blamed for switching lanes. Similarly, if I was walking around and someone bumped into me and that caused me to bump someone else and then they fall, they break their leg, I wasn't in control of my actions when I got bumped into that other person. So again, it would seem odd to hold me accountable or responsible or blameworthy for such a thing. What this means is something like this. It looks like in order for us to be morally responsible, for us to be legitimately blamed for wrongdoing, it has to be the case that we're both aware of what we're doing and we're in control of what we're doing. But here's the thing. While that seems like a reasonable view, when we talk about releasing AI agents or developing AI agents that go off and do their own thing, if they go off and do crazy stuff that we didn't predict and we're not in control of because we can't monitor them at every second, it sure looks like we're morally responsible. If I develop an AI agent and I release it onto the internet and it causes all this harm, it sure looks like I'm responsible for this thing, even though after I've released the agent into the wild, I could no longer control the agent. I'm not aware of what it's going to do next. So this raises a certain kind of puzzle. How do we square how we standardly think about moral responsibility in that it requires us to be aware of what we're doing and in control of what we're doing, and at the same time also think that we're morally responsible for these agents that we can neither predict or control? So this is the puzzle that my guest focuses on. His name is Fabio Tollon. He's a postdoctoral researcher on the Bridging Responsible AI Divides, or BRAID program at the University of Edinburgh. There's a number of topics that we cover here. One way of thinking about this that we talk about is, should we be thinking about our responsibility as it relates to AI agents in something like the way we think about the moral responsibility of parents when their children do bad things? Is that an apt analogy? Is it inapt? That's one of the topics of discussion. Another thing that we talk about is this responsibility gap. So AI agents are created by lots of different teams, dozens, maybe even hundreds of teams across hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And it's not clear when things go sideways who should be held responsible. Should it be the person who greenlit the agent for deployment? Should it be the data scientists? Who is it? It's just not clear. Part of this is what's called the problem of many hands. The problem of many hands is when lots of people are involved in a wrongdoing, even though each person's individual action doesn't look like it's wrong. So we talk a lot about that. And then finally, one of the things that Fabio talks about is this crucial distinction that he makes between being morally responsible and being morally answerable. So when you're morally responsible, you are blameworthy when you've done something wrong and praiseworthy when you've done something right. And he thinks that there's something called moral answerability, which is kind of like, I don't know, something like an attenuated or a thinner version of that sort of thing. He gives an interesting example. The example that he gives is of his cat. So if he invites me over, he says, and he tells me in advance, hey, listen, my cat scratches if you touch it, so don't touch the cat, it'll scratch you. But then maybe I forget, maybe, whatever, I'm too cavalier, and I scratch the cat or I touch the cat, and it scratches me, it claws my face or whatever. In that case, he thinks that he's not morally responsible for the damage the cat has done to me because he warned me, but he does think that he's answerable, morally answerable in some way. He thinks that, for instance, maybe he owes me some kind of apology. He should say, okay, I'll be the one to get you the bandage. I'm not just going to say good luck to you. And that's a way in which he's answerable. So answerability is supposed to be, again, a kind of attenuated version of being morally responsible, but doesn't get you all the way to blame. The idea, Fabio's idea anyway, is that if you have this notion of moral answerability, you might use that to close the responsibility gap. So if we've got all these hands, and we're not sure who's responsible, you might think that there might be a situation in which no one's morally responsible, which is to say that no one's worthy of blame in this instance, but there are people in that chain who are properly morally answerable. And then we talk about whether that's a plausible solution to fill in the gap. I think he thinks, obviously, it's important and plausible. I'm a little inclined to skepticism here. I'm a little inclined to think that it doesn't sort of scratch the moral itch we have that when something goes terribly wrong, some AI kills my kids. The fact that someone is answerable doesn't scratch that itch for me. I think there's some people who are to blame for it, or perhaps there's no one to blame and that just sucks. But this notion of moral answerability is not going to solve any problems. He thinks, of course, that I'm wrong. And so we talk about that. And it's a super interesting conversation. Okay, that's what our conversation is about. As I've said many times before, my book is out, The Ethical Nightmare Challenge. You can buy that on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Walmart and Target and blah, blah, blah. And if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, trenchant criticisms, you can always email me at em@readblackman.com. All right, that's it. Let's go talk to Fabio. So Fabio, in one way, your thesis is, I would think it's uncontroversial, but actually, as we spoke about already, and you'll tell us in a second, it is actually pretty controversial. So the idea is something like, when we release AI agents into the world, autonomous AI agents doing their thing, quote unquote, reasoning, making decisions, acting, that we're responsible for those things. And I think a lot of people think, yeah, of course, it's our tools. We made the tools, and so we're responsible if the things go sideways. But you actually think it's a controversial thing to say, a philosophically contentious claim to make.
Yeah, at the very least, it seems like the claim undermines important things that we would think are necessary for normal responsibility when we think about specifically moral responsibility for human agents. So in cases where we're normally responsible for things, we think you should know what you're doing, right? So you should have some kind of awareness of what it is you're doing, and you should be in control of what you're doing, right? So you shouldn't be acting on the basis of, you shouldn't be manipulated or coerced into doing what you're doing. So when we apply that to AI agents or autonomous systems, we can see how those two conditions might come under strain, because it seems like we might know that we are deploying a system, right? We might be responsible for that act of deployment. But if the system can make decisions or act on the basis of reasons that it can decide on the fly while it's been deployed, we might think that seems like no human has the right kind of control over the system in that instance. And no human has access to the reasoning that the system is employing when it is deployed live.
Okay, so I want to break some of that down. That all sounds plausible. So first of all, when you say moral responsibility, I take it you mean something like deserving of praise and blame when things go well or poorly. Like, I do something really well, I deserve praise. I betray my friend, I deserve blame. That's what it is to be morally responsible. Is that how you're thinking about moral responsibility?
Something like that. Although I would say that I think the praise and blame, the focus on praise and blame is part of what I think artificially constrains the way we talk about responsibility, especially in relation to AI. So I think we might think it's just straightforward that we don't blame people for things for the consequences of their actions that are not intentional, right? So we might say they're responsible, but we don't think they're blameworthy. So one little concept.
We would say they're causally responsible. We would say they're causally responsible, but not morally.
And one move that I think is really useful in the moral domain, because I think I still want to use the language of sort of the moral language here when we're talking about really bad harms. We can say there's a difference between an agent being blameworthy for something versus them being answerable for that thing. So blameworthiness might attach to things like a stronger sort of social sanction, but answerability refers to just the capacity to answer for. So to either provide reasons or a justification, or to at least be expected to apologize for what's happened. So it turns on this idea if you think about responsibility, just the word responsibility, like an ability to respond. Answerability really taps into that and says we can be responsible for things in the sense that we can answer for them in a way that we can answer for things where we're not at fault necessarily, but we're still responsible, which like traces the sort of causal responsibility that you've outlined there, but is a bit stronger.
Okay, so I think I followed all that. One question is going to be about the connection between answerability and blameworthiness. As in, does one entail the other? So I would think that if you're the kind of creature that can be blamed for doing the wrong thing, so a dog eats your shoes, you might not blame the dog or something like that. They don't deserve moral blame because they didn't really understand what they were doing or the implications of it, et cetera, et cetera. So I would think that if you're blameworthy, then you're also probably the kind of thing that can give answers. who's capable of giving answers.
Yeah,
So
I think so.
probably blameworthiness entails answerability, but it's not the other way around. So you could be answerable. So why'd you do this? Because I owe you an answer, blah, 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 blah. And then I find out, oh, I see. You did it because you were manipulated and you didn't know it. So I don't blame you.
Yeah, even though we would still say you're responsible in some version of responsibility. So we get the outcome we want where we locate a causal chain in relation to an agent, but we don't get the same morally loaded language.
Sure. Yeah. I would just say they're causal. We get causal responsibility without the moral responsibility. But okay, yeah, we're gonna lose our whole audience if we get into the weeds of this. But I get your point. But the other thing that I want to focus on is not just how we're thinking about moral responsibility, but the conditions under which we hold people to be morally responsible. And you laid out two criteria. One is that they intend to do what they're doing, right?
Or at least they know what the consequences of what they're doing might be. They have a sort
they know the consequences.
Yeah.
And what's the other one?
The other one is that it's within their control.
And so give me just quickly two examples where those conditions aren't met, and so we want to withhold attributing moral responsibility.
Yeah. So with the control condition, these are usually sort of manipulation conditions, right? Where an agent is coerced into doing something harmful happens, and it's just clear to us that the agent wasn't fully in control of what was happening. They were being manipulated either directly or coerced. And that undermines the conditions. If an evil scientist, plants like a chip in my brain that sort of fires neurons in a certain way, and I act in harmful ways, it seems obvious there that I'm doing stuff in the world, I'm causing harm, I'm the causal locus of these harms, but I'm being coerced, so the control condition isn't met, so I'm not morally on the hook. In the case of the knowledge condition, we would say if you were acting on accidents, for example, right? If I spill something on someone next to me and they look at me in disgust because I've messed up their latest suit. But the reason I did that was because I was bumped or because something happened to me that I wasn't aware of, that wasn't part of the evidence I had before making the decision, or I didn't make the decision intentionally, then that undermines the knowledge condition because I didn't know what I was doing would lead to this harmful outcome.
Right. I would think that you could take more sort of butterfly effect type things, right? Where I took a right at the light on a red, but I was legally permitted to take a right on red, but I didn't realize that would cause X, Y, and Z, and then there was a car crash, and so I played some role in the causal chain, but I couldn't have known that my taking a right on red, which was legal, was going to cause the harm that it did down the road.
Yeah, and I think that also works.
Okay, so where are we now? So we're trying to figure out why typically we think that we're only in control. We're only really, I think, blameworthy, or at least morally responsible for when we know what it is that we're doing and we know the consequences of what we're doing. We know the consequences of what we're doing and we are in control of what we're doing. Yeah. Okay. Now say more about why this, and that seems reasonable, right? It seems, because I take it seems unfair if you blame me for doing things that I had no control over. So if, to use your example, I get bumped and I spill the coffee on someone's suit, and you blame me, it seems unfair to blame me. It's like, why do I have control over that? Or if I take a right on red and there's these knock-on effects. So look, I didn't know the consequences of my taking a right on red, or I didn't know the consequences of my whatever. And so why are you blaming me? Like I couldn't, especially if I couldn't have known or I shouldn't have known, we can play around with that stuff, but it seems unfair to blame me.
Yeah.
Okay. So now where does this sit with or relate to, how does it relate to AI agent talk?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to do is be a bit, I think AI agents a lot of people are talking about AI agents in a very specific way right now.
Yeah.
And I don't really know if I have anything to say about current specific AI agents that are being deployed in settings where they're
Sure.
So I'm thinking more in like the very basic sense of a system that can act autonomously. That's what I'm thinking of as AI agents. So we don't need to have like a language model tacked onto it and that it can perform specific kinds of actions in the world. I'm thinking in a more general sense, you have a system that can be deployed and can act independently of human oversight and control. And
does that include any automated system?
It could. Yeah, that's what I want to work from, is that we're thinking about systems that can act. So these could predate AI applications, right? You could have autonomous systems that predate AI. But I think the interesting bit is when you have a system with AI capabilities, or that's a machine learning system. I think those systems obstruct those two conditions in interesting ways that other forms of independently, like deep space satellite probes that are deployed and are independent. They're independent of human. Like, we can't control them. They're set in a course and they do their thing. It seems like there's something importantly different between that and a drone, an autonomous drone, or a self-driving car. Yeah. So what I would say about AI specifically and how it's undermining these two conditions is that I think the control condition is relatively easy to imagine. Like I just said, the satellite, a deep space explorer type thing, that the control condition is undermined. If we think more locally, when we give up with self-driving cars, if we give up control over the vehicle, so many vehicles now still have a hands-on condition with sensors, but we can imagine that we would relax that. We're then giving up control of the system. And it seems like then the claim that we are responsible might be undermined, at least on the control side. I think the epistemic condition, so the knowledge condition, like what we can know about the system, I think that's where machine learning, big data stuff became really important, because there we had the amount of data that the system could process and the patterns that they could extract were often inscrutable even to the people who developed these systems. So not even the expert can understand why the system has recommended a particular course of action. And a recommendation is, of course, not a decision. So decision support systems might not undermine responsibility in important ways because they're helping people make decisions. But systems that combine the control condition and this epistemic condition, so they're deployed outside of human control and they can make decisions outside of that control on the basis of evidence or information that human users find inscrutable or cannot understand. In those cases, I think we have a potentially legitimate worry about a responsibility gap, because it seems like we can't trace or track responsibility back to humans in a way, like you said, that's fair, right? That's the important work. It seems like it would be, the intuition is maybe it's unfair to hold those humans responsible.
Yeah. Okay. So I see the intuitive appeal of the two criteria for thinking that you need your necessary conditions for holding somebody morally responsible. So on the one hand, it's something like, surely, if we're going to hold somebody morally responsible for the harm they've incurred, they knew the consequences of what they were doing and they were in control of what they were doing. Surely, that seems totally obvious. But then we got this other claim that also strikes me as pretty obvious. Surely, if John releases an AI agent into the wild and it causes all sorts of destruction, surely John's morally responsible for releasing this maniac AI agent into the world. But those are an unhappy pair. Those two thoughts, those two intuitions, they're not compatible.
Yeah, it seems...
So that's a puzzle.
The puzzle is then, if you think these two things are incompatible, right?
Yeah.
You can make certain moves. You can say, then something about our theory of responsibility seems wrong, right? Then we've gone wrong somewhere and we need to update the theory, or we need to just rethink about how we're thinking.
Or we need to give John a break.
Or need to give John a break. Yeah, exactly. Well, John couldn't have known. So I like using these technologies as foils to rethink, well, how do we think the theory needs to change in light of the potential conceptual disruption that the technology generates? So I see that they might be incompatible at one level, but I think at other levels, it's really instructive to see, is the theory doing the work we want it to do?
Yeah. I want to ask a question. Maybe this is a little bit out of left field, and you can tell me, don't worry about it, or something like that. But one thing that immediately occurs to me is how we think about parents and the extent to which they're responsible for AI. And it seems like if your kid does really bad shit, I guess typically do we blame them? I guess sometimes we blame the parents and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we do blame the parents because we could point out places where there was obvious neglect or something like that, or bad parenting. Other times we say, yeah, parents only have so much control and they look to have done all the things that one could have done as a responsible parent, or that we could reasonably expect of them, and so they're not responsible. So how does that, I don't know what to do with that thought, other than I want to ask, how does that sort of, the way we think about parental responsibility for the misdeeds of children compare to that general principle of, here are two necessary conditions for holding somebody morally responsible, and two, how does it change, or how does it affect how we think about responsibility for AI agents? Or autonomous systems generally?
Yeah, no, I think this handlers approach is a good one. If you consider parents as handlers of their kids and the owners of dogs potentially as the handlers of their dogs, and they are responsible for their animals. So I think that's a really useful model here, because we're dealing with a responsible agent, the human, who has the role of being a supervisor or a caretaker for an autonomous system, right? A dog or a child.
Right.
So I think it's a useful model. Where it breaks down potentially is that when we were talking about moral responsibility, all the examples we've been using, we've been talking about direct responsibility, right? So an agent is directly responsible for the harm. That's usually what moral responsibility traces. Whereas it seems like this handler style analogy, do we really think that, I don't know, people have had very different responses to this claim. So you could give me your how you think about this, but are parents always directly responsible for what their children do in the same way? Or is it the case that it's this more attenuated? Because you seem to suggest it there, right? That we don't think parents are fully to blame for everything their parents do, but their children do, but they're responsible in some, it feels like they're still responsible in some way.
They might, I think it's just an open question and it's case-by-case basis. The question is, did the parents do what should be reasonably expected of parents to do as regards the shaping of their children, something along those lines? Recognizing that, I like to say, like, you can't make the Colosseum out of Play-Doh. The kid's a certain way. The parents can only shape so much. They're not just dealing with a sort of tabula rasa. They're not dealing with a thing with no, if you like, inherent predispositions and the like. Yeah, so anyway, and then if a child murders another child or something, we're going to want to find out, how did they murder? Did they use the parent's gun? Was the parent's gun in a safe? Was there a lock? Did they teach the kid about gun safety? Was the kid aware that there was a gun? Do the parents beat the kid? Do they neglect him? Was there a parent around? We're going to ask lots of questions to try to get to the bottom of what the hell happened here. And I take that in some particular cases, we're going to say those parents were utterly negligent, or they were abusive, or they were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then that's what explains the child's behavior. And so they take a share in the blame. And I think in other cases, you just get these parents did everything right, but the kid is just genetics, whatever. Bad shit happens sometimes and the apple falls far from the tree and there's nothing you can really do about it.
And I think that the way you've laid that out is really neat, because one of the things that answerability does in this case, I think, is it answers all those why questions that you're engaged in, right? We want to know, did the parents act negligently? Why might we expect this kind of behavior from a child? At that level, we're talking about responsibility as answerability. We're dealing with the parents as responsible agents, and we're gathering information. And at some point, we might say, they're excused from blame. They did all they could. They have acted in a responsible manner. They did all they could for the child, but bad things still happen, shit still happens, whatever. Yeah. But in other cases, after engaging in this practice, we realize, shit, no, actually, they didn't do their due diligence, they didn't take care. And so then they're morally responsible in the sense of being blameworthy. So I think you can see then how these two senses of responsibility can build on each other, at least in one way, where answerability helps us determine.
Yeah, if they weren't answerable, then they couldn't be blameworthy.
Yeah. And answerability helps us establish whether they might be blameworthy, and how that could apply in the case of animals in the same way, right? If you come over to my house and I have a cat, and even if I warn you and I say, listen, my cat, like, don't touch her stomach, like, she's going to go at you. And I'm like, you're a bird. And you do that anyway, right? You touch her on the stomach and she goes at you and you're standing there like your arm is bleeding. Now, I've given you warning, right? I've taken that duty of care seriously to protect you, yet you acted badly in any case. It still seems like, because I have the role of being the sort of a responsible guest, a host or whatever, I'm still answerable for what my cat does to you. I still should at least say, listen, I'm sorry that happened. Let me get you like a bandage or some antiseptic. There are still things that are expected of me, even though I'm not to blame and even though I gave you warning. So it works both ways. It's like, it depends on, it's a case-by-case basis whether a parent or a handler is blameworthy, but also by virtue of being in that role, you incur certain responsibilities that exist even if you're not blameworthy.
Yeah. Okay, so shouldn't we just say the same thing about responsibility in AI agents that we say about parents and their kids? When an AI agent runs amok, does some crazy shit, and I wonder if maybe we don't think this. So here's one way. One way we could go is we could say it's just like parents and children. We're going to check to see if the developers, the data scientists, etc., Did they do their due diligence? They do their checking, blah, 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 blah. Did they have monitoring tools in place? And if they did all the things that we can reasonably expect of them, but still, let's say, people die, maybe we would say, like we would of the parent, yeah, there's only so much you can do, blah, 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 blah. But I guess my instinct is that most people would not feel the same way, that they would think, no, data scientists have greater control over their AI creations than parents do over their children, because they choose the training data, they choose the learning algorithms, they choose the blah, 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 blah. They choose how to fine tune and who fine tunes and how they do it and blah. So it seems like there's a level of control, at least from the outside. It seems like there's a level of control that AI developers have that parents of human children do not, such that the AI developers never get that sort of, hey, you did the best you could. Yeah, that's what does that sound right?
Yeah, I think that there's one tension point there, which is that talking about AI developers in a loose sense, I think also risks undermine or like downplaying who really has control over these systems.
Yeah.
Like, it's not clear to me that even like a senior project lead has the strong sense of control over the conditions of deployment, how that system is deployed, and what contracts the company might engage with on the basis of the product that they've produced or the system that they've produced. So I think maybe looking at individual data scientists is even the wrong level at which to try and determine whether there's appropriate control. And if we look potentially at executives within a company making decisions about deployment, maybe that's the right level of control. And that
it's the problem of many hands, right? It's just, there's so many cooks in the kitchen. There's so many decision makers. There's so many, the people who collected the training data is different from the people who chose the learning algorithm is different from who chose the model architecture, is different from who whatever tested and validated, is different from the red teamers, is different from blah, blah, blah. So is different from the executive or the set of executives that actually greenlight things. There's the risk and compliance crew, there's the legal crew, so when things go sideways, who's responsible?
There's too many. Exactly. There's too many to make a determination. And I think that's where I think this takes us, right? This consideration of these two conditions and reflecting on how AI systems are actually produced in practice. It seems like, where does the responsibility go? It's once you feed in details into the theory, it's like, it seems to just disappear. And that's why I think this responsibility gap challenge is really, it's quite important, because it does seem like we start out thinking, no, of course, it's just humans who are responsible. And then we end up with shit. Where are the humans? There's too many of them. It's like it's a Manhattan Project type situation where there are too many people involved, and it's unclear who really done it, besides maybe the person who pushes the button to launch the system, to launch the warhead, or to deploy the system. And even then, it doesn't seem obvious that our intuitions would align.
It seems too narrow to just pin it on the person who said go, I think. Or the person who says go is sitting at the end of a very long causal chain of people making all sorts of decisions about which they can't possibly be fully informed. It's too much stuff. So they have to rely on summary, shorthand, shortcuts by the people who report to them.
Yeah. And that's why one way if we think this is a real paradox, right? If we think, well, it does really seem like responsibility, if I've got you there to that point where you're thinking, shit, does it break down? Then I think we're in a good spot. Or if you have any further objections to like the spot we're in now, or like ways you could see responsibility maybe being meted out.
I don't know. I guess one thing that I'll just note, this is not my view, but if you think that they're engaged in AI agents in particular, I'm thinking not any automated system. If you really think that they're engaged in decision-making and reasoning and acting, then I think you'd have to think it's like a child or a teenager or something like that, but it's an agent. It's a legit agent who bears moral responsibility. But and then I don't know what to do with any of that. What do we do if agents are genuinely morally responsible? I don't know. But I also don't think that they are making genuine decisions, or I'm not in that camp.
Yeah. No, I think that, so one suggestion, and this is not mine, this is Floridi's suggestion. And he basically says, we can decouple intelligence and agency. These two things come apart. So calling these things artificial intelligence that's a misnomer, but these are agents. They're doing stuff. but they're not intelligent. They're not intelligent in the way that we are intelligent, in the way that we can make decisions, form beliefs, have desires, all of that stuff. They don't have that. They've got something else, but they're definitely doing stuff. They're definitely agential in the sense that they are cause and effects. Causes, they can cause things, and those causes can have effects in some way. So one way out of it is to say that's a way that they're not like children. They don't have the intelligence bit, but they have the agency bit. And if we strip out the intelligence bit, if we strip out the mental content stuff, where does that leave us with responsibility? What kind of responsibility then is at play? Because then we could have these systems doing a bunch of things, not needing to traffic in the language. Because I'm not the biggest fan of saying that these systems decide or act on the basis of reasons. I think we're using those in scare quotes, and thus it makes it easier. So if we can strip the intelligence bit out and we just keep the agency stuff, then the model becomes something like what we're interested in is what kinds of things can they do, and what kinds of effects can these things have. And here we're thinking about sort of social effects. These are systems that can act in the world of humans. They can harm humans, they can damage humans. And then we don't need to worry about the responsibility of the system because we've stripped the intelligence part. We don't need to worry about whether the system is morally responsible in that loaded sense. And we can focus on the harms because the systems can do things that can harm actual agents who can experience pain and suffer. So this move can shift the focus from the agent to the patient being us who suffer the harms. And that, I think, it's a kind of neat move because it shifts our analysis. Then we say, who's responsible for AI becomes figuring out what are the social effects of the system. And if we can figure out those, we can figure out whether, when we look at the AI pipeline, what kinds of intentions existed in that pipeline. Did anyone intend? And we might get back to the problem of many hands, right? Then it becomes difficult to figure it out. So yeah, it's unclear that really resolves the pressing many hands issue. Yeah. But at the very least, shows how these systems are different from from children or dogs.
Yeah. Okay. So if we agree that they're not actually engaged in decision-making and reasoning and action, okay. So I've lost sight now, though, of, so either we can go with, what do we go with? We have to amend our theory about what people are responsible for in some way that makes it the case that we can do some decent job at articulating who's responsible or to what degree in that long causal chain that leads to the agent doing what they do. That's option number one, I take it.
Yeah.
And option number two is to say, no, the theory is fine. The problem is just that we're in a shitty situation where we've got these things that are not themselves morally responsible and nobody else is morally responsible. And so we just have, to use your phrase earlier, a responsibility gap, which is just, this is what I've referred to in other contexts as, it's just a shitty situation. Yeah. Bad things are happening, but nobody in particular is responsible.
Yeah, and I think if we buy that that's the current situation, that it really is.
Your view that keep the theory about the two conditions for responsibility and relinquish the view that there's people responsible when automated systems go wrong?
No, that's not my view at all. No, my view is, I think we can borrow a lot from engineering ethics here. So engineers, how I understand engineering is basically make a mistake once. The whole discipline, I think, is predicated on that idea. And that's why you have standards develop in engineering, right? Because you make a mistake once and then it becomes a standard. And then that standard gets iterated and gets tested. And engineering as a field is really successful because it can do that. It can generate standards of best practices and codes of conduct. And a really interesting thing happened where engineering ethics is now a thing. It's a common thing that we talk about, but computer ethics was a thing in the sort of 80s and 90s, but lost. And there are very few professional bodies representing sort of the ethics for people who work in computer science, or at least in these roles in making these AI systems. And what I think is really interesting about engineering ethics is that things go wrong, right, with engineering projects. There can be natural disasters, unforeseeable events that cause harm. And we don't say, in some cases when there's negligence, we say the engineers are responsible. Sure. But in cases where there's not negligence, and it really is just shitty things happening, to use the technical phrase, it's just shitty, there's nothing we can do about it. In those cases, we still expect, in some cases, engineers or professional bodies to step forward and say, listen, we could have done this better, we could have done that better, to show that they're answerable, but also, and I think this is the important bit, is that engineering as a profession has earned public trust by demonstrating that they can step in when things do go wrong. So when it's not a natural disaster and it is indeed a failure of practice, we expect engineers in general to step forward and say, yeah, our bad, we're on the hook here. And that solidifies the trust that we put in these professionals. And I think we don't have a similar story to tell about computer science, and not just computer science, but the entire AI pipeline. I think we can't tell a similar story. And I think the story that where I think my own view on this is, that's where the real sort of intervention can lie, not in seeing responsibility gaps as a narrowing of what we're responsible for, but seeing them as this expansive opportunity to take responsibility. Just like engineering disasters are opportunities for engineers to really demonstrate their value and to earn public trust, the trust of governments, the trust of agencies. We can see failures of AI systems deployed at scale, even if autonomous and unforeseeable, as opportunities for agents within that pipeline to step forward and take responsibility. And this kind of gets around the problem of many hands in a way, because then you have socially responsible agents making themselves responsible, as opposed to us going to to find them to be socially responsible. So I guess this is like a philosopher's trick, because is that likely? Like, how do we make it such that people would be willing to take responsibility and accept the fallout that comes from that potentially? But this is one solution that I think could be useful.
So I don't know if pushback is quite the right. Let me try to re-articulate what you said, but I'm going to slightly make it different. I'm not going to you talk about taking responsibility. I'm not exactly sure how that fits in yet, as opposed to just being responsible. Typically, I think we think that people are responsible, and so they ought to take responsibility for what they are in fact responsible for. It's not my fault. Yes, it is your fault. It is your fault. Take responsibility. That's the first thing to just note. But let me cast this in a different way, and let me see if how this gels with what you've just said. When you articulated the two necessary conditions for a person being responsible, that they know the consequences and they're in control of their actions, the scope of application was individuals. It's like these individuals, for an individual to be responsible, is for them to know the consequences and to be in control of their action. Okay. And suppose I said, look, what you're saying is, it's also true of collectives or groups. So there's the set of engineers, such that if the set of engineers, the community, the cult, whatever you want to call them, the group of engineers, if the group or the culture, the organization that is the engineers, is making buildings that topple whenever there's a relatively minor earthquake, then that means the engineers at some point, maybe not early on, but at some point, they know enough such that they know the consequences of building a building in such a way that it's going to collapse. And they're in control of how they build these buildings. And so the engineering community, when they said, yeah, that's on us, we'll take responsibility, that was, I want to say, them taking responsibility, but it didn't create a newfound responsibility. It's just the collective recognizing the responsibility that the engineering community has when they're building buildings. And then I want to say the same thing about the computer science world, or the world of data science, or the people who are developing AI. Maybe we can't find the individual or even the group of individuals the small group of individuals who's responsible for AI agents gone wild. But the set of them at this point, they know, or they're beginning to know, it's beginning to dawn upon them, when we create AI agents in such and such a way, we know some consequences, at least in broad strokes. We know about bias, we know about blah, 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 hallucinations, and they're in control of how those agents get designed, built, tested, deployed, monitored, blah, 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 blah. And so the collective of data scientists is responsible. They meet those two conditions. Theory is totally intact. And what we need now is for those data scientists to recognize that they've got that responsibility.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the end of my
I think that's a really nice way of putting it. And the one thing that still, like, I'm not clear on is this, your first point, right? Which is that when you take responsibility, is it not just, because you ended in saying they recognize they're responsible, and recognizing you're responsible just means you were responsible all along. You've now only just seen it. You didn't do anything different by taking responsibility. Maybe you got some.
It's an acknowledgement. It's like a different attitude towards what your responsibilities are.
Yeah.
It's an acknowledgement, not a creation of those responsibilities.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that if we look at the different responses in different kinds of communities, we can start to trace how different communities respond to harms in different ways. So when we think about, I guess, Google's famous firing of Meg Mitchell and Timnit Gebru, we think that wasn't a good way to respond. That wasn't a responsible way to respond to people who are calling out some harmful instances with harmful cases of AI application within your company. So that seems bad. And then these companies, maybe they get better at doing this because they realize that they can build, I don't know, institutional clout, or they can build public trust. So I think what's important is that I think that there is a sense in which you can take responsibility for something when it is not just recognizing that you were responsible all along. I think you can take responsibility in a way that actually is an act of creation. So I'll give you an example, and then we can see if my intuition tracks your intuition here. So I think this was in 2018. Google had a project with the Department of Defense, Project Maven, and they released an open letter, Google employees, and thousands of Google employees signed the open letter saying, we do not want to engage with this contract because the contract was about image recognition tech that was going to be used in military applications. So this open letter was signed by team leads who are working on a previous version of Project Maven. It was signed by your average junior data scientist who was working under a team lead, didn't have control. But it was also signed by many rank and file Google employees. So someone who's maintaining an unrelated data set, someone who is working at the reception desk. And those employees there who signed that open letter, I think what they're doing is they are taking responsibility for something that they didn't necessarily have knowledge of fully and that they weren't in control of. And I think they're creating a kind of responsibility, and they're demonstrating a commitment to shared social values. And I think that is not just a recognition. When responsibility taking involves a recognition of shared social value, and the agent is not properly entangled with the potential harm, I think in those cases, we have an act of creation with respect to responsibility. And those cases might be really useful for thinking about responsibility gaps in terms of professional roles, because then it seems like what we would expect is that even if some subset of a group are acting in a way that isn't good, other members of that group who are related can call that out and say, listen, that's bad. We are within this group and we can recognize that that's a harmful action. I guess maybe a bad example, but those who split from OpenAI to form Anthropic, a move like that. They're doing this the wrong way. We're going to do this. We're going to take responsibility for AI development.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of things to say. Number one is, I don't know that those people who were not involved directly in Project Maven, so the indirect, the secretary or the whatever, the desk attendant, that's not a phrase. Anyway, I think you say it's an act of taking responsibility, it's an act of creating responsibility. It just seems to me like they're going above and beyond the call of duty. But they're not creating a responsibility. They're just saying, here's something I really care about. It's not my responsibility to do it. I'm certainly not blameworthy if I don't. Maybe I'm deserving of praise if I do, but it's because I'm going above and beyond the call of duty, not because I'm heeding the call of duty. So that's one thing, but okay. But whatever, that's relatively minor. Even if it's the case, even if I grant you they are taking on this responsibility, it is this creative act of creating responsibilities, it wouldn't be the analogous to the data scientists who are involved in the building of AI systems that ultimately act in an automated way where bad things happen, blah, blah. So I might say, yeah, fine, the Google junior person who has nothing to do is just maintaining some irrelevant data set. Yeah, fine, they created a responsibility. But that's not the case with these data scientists. They should be in the business of recognizing the responsibility. The third and last thing I'll say is, maybe this is too big of a question or it should be a separate thing, but so when some particular AI agent does some bad thing, and let's say someone dies, it's not particularly satisfying to say, oh, who's responsible? The set of data scientists, the community. Okay, yeah, fine, but that's not exactly scratching my moral responsibility itch.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the problem here, I think it's a feature of just moral responsibility in general, is that the greater the harm, the sort of higher the demand for this strongly morally loaded sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important, thing to hold in view, that part of the story has to be, how do we deal with victims of these harms? And how does that feed into the story of responsibility that we want to tell? So one part of the story, which I think we can tell, is that the problem of many hands is usually refers to cases where there are just too many parties to be responsible, and we can't locate one entity who is responsible. I still think answerability gives us some resources here where we can say, even if we can't find who done it, who's the one actor in the causal chain, what we can say is we can scrutinize the pipeline, right? We can see what kinds of decisions were made, and that can be a building block to what I think is at least a solution that says there really aren't these deeply philosophically problematic responsibility gaps. Because that's what I want to get to, is that while these gaps seem intuitively plausible, I think their intuitive plausibility rests on a blame-centric model of responsibility. And that if we relax that requirement for responsibility and we say blame is one kind of responsibility, it's the most morally, the strongest version of this kind of responsibility, but acknowledging that agents can respond and give reasons for their actions in the pipeline can help us in figuring that out. And when we have cases that involve people dying, very serious cases, I think then the question kind of changes to who made a decision to deploy a system in a morally sensitive environment, not necessarily who contributed to the development of that system. Yeah. And I think that changes where we're looking here, because we're looking at, more often than not, these cases are either military or commercial. And so someone's deploying a system to gain something, and it's unclear that this is at the level of lead data engineer, that they're making a decision on the context of deployment.
Yeah, okay, so a couple of things. Everything you say, I say a couple of things. I guess I don't understand the answerability stuff so much. I don't know why that's satisfying in any way. To me, so far, it sounds like, hey, listen, you're dealing with a person who can answer questions, not with inanimate objects. It's okay. That's good. But if they're going to answer me in such a way that I don't get to scratch that moral itch, then it doesn't, but it helps. If my children are dead now because of the AI, and you could say, well, these data scientists are answerable, but they're not morally to blame. And I say, oh, great, so I can ask them a bunch of questions, and then they give me some answers. But, oh, yeah, I chose that data set because it was efficiently produced and it was relatively clean. Okay, thanks a lot. What does that do for me and my dead children?
Yeah.
So I don't know what...
Yeah, I think the answerability bit doesn't give you that. But what it gives you is a potential solution to the many hands problem.
How, though? It just sounds like, why aren't you just changing what typically we mean by moral responsibility, which entails things like praise and blame? And you're saying, actually, no, it's this other thing. That's when I say, no, it's not. When I say they're morally responsible, someone needs to be blamed and possibly punished, condemned. My outrage and anger should be directed appropriately at certain parties for my dead children. Do I get that with answerability? Because if not, it's not the moral responsibility I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I think what answerability is meant to do, its theoretical upside, is it accounts for cases where we don't have fault. That's basically what its real utility is. It accounts for no fault responsibility. And that you might think, okay, in some cases of deployment, there isn't a fault, but we still want a responsible party, right? We still want, these very serious moral emotions need to find an appropriate target. And my sense in those cases is that we're just missing a sort of a leadership class within the field, right? Who we see as socially trustworthy agents. There are very few leaders, CEOs of companies deploying these systems who are seen as sort of building real widespread public trust. And, is that where you would want to direct the moral emotion to, the sort of, because you're not going to direct it at the company itself. That might be.
So let me speak up for the CEOs, because if someone doesn't speak up for the CEOs of large enterprises, who will? So let me come to the moral aid of these otherwise defenseless souls. I think that, and I speak here as a former academic of 10 plus years, we see the CEO of a company as atop this pyramid, and that they know everything that's going on. They see everything that's going on. They give their orders, and everyone beneath the pyramid just falls in line. And it's a complete caricature. But if you're a CEO of a company that oversees 100,000 people, 50,000 people, there's only so much you can know about what's actually going on. You have to be necessarily steeped in ignorance about the vast majority of things that are going on in your own company. There's no way around that as far as I can see.
Mm-hmm.
And policies will always people don't give a shit about policies, or they do, or anyway. So I think that we would love, in some cases, it's clear there's a CEO or something like that to blame. But I think in lots of cases, you're just dealing with these individuals who are managing these phenomenally complex machines that we've built, social machines that we've built called corporations, and they just can't do that much. I think there's some certain big decisions they make, of course, that does move the needle and how the company operates, et cetera, but there's so much that they can't know. Like, they can't know, especially if they're not technologists by background, they can't know about the decision-making process throughout the development of the AI. I mean, that's just, it's above their pay grade in some sense.
Yeah.
But that's actually, but then here's where I think we diverge. You think we need to find some kind of satisfaction, and we can find that satisfaction in answerability, where we get something like responsibility, even if we don't get blameworthiness. And I guess I'm more inclined to something far more cynical, which is you can look all you want. There's nothing. You're just not going to get the satisfaction that you want. Answerability is not going to give it to you. It's a shitty situation because we live in a phenomenally complex society where responsibility does in fact get distributed to the point of basically dissipating altogether. And you're just left holding the shitty ball in your hands, and that's life.
Yeah. No, I think that's, I don't know if we're disagreeing so much as that, because I think that experience, that's a legitimate experience, and I don't see answerability as scratching that itch. I don't think it can do that work, the sort of emotional work, right? That we want, that we maybe, I don't know if we want it to do or we expect it to do, but I don't think it can do that. But I think in some cases it can. But I think those cases are no fault cases where we don't find negligence, where something hasn't gone wrong. I think it's far harder when we have something go wrong and then we want answerability to do that work. Like you say, that's just going to be psychologically unsatisfying. And a way around that is, at least one route I could see, is a different framing of, not framing, but like a different positioning of these big tech companies, which sees them as socially responsible agents. That's one way to reduce, if there was a consensus that, these companies, they really are doing their best to protect people, and like things go wrong and that's okay. But I think the reason that maybe you're imagining a case and you're thinking that really wouldn't scratch my itch, it's because we're just operating from the assumption that these companies will do bad things in the service of profit. And that's just normal. That's the shitty world.
No, that would be, but that's something within our control to some extent anyway.
Yeah. So that's where I think this, like, how I see it is that we have these AI agents, whatever they are, they have a kind of social power, right? Once deployed, they can do damage to real moral agents, to vulnerable moral agents. And I think that's, and I think that's the thing to hold at the center of the discussion. It's not so much when making a determination of who done it, rather, but who does it affect and how might it affect them, and working backwards from that and seeing how do we cash that out. But the sort of psychological impact of these harms where you don't have a clear agent, I don't have a good answer for how to regulate that, because that might be unique. A rock falling off of a hill and killing a loved one, right? That's just an accident. It's clear it's an act of God in a way. But people making systems and deploying them at scale, which leads to similar outcomes, the moral emotions are going to be different.
Yeah. All right, Fabio, thank you so much. This has given me a lot to think about. I'm going to have to listen to this several times because I'm sure that you said things that sort of I didn't catch well enough or at all. So this has been fascinating stuff. So thanks so much for coming on and talking about it.
Yeah, Reed, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I want to thank a few people who make this all possible. Delano Alexander, he's my producer. He does such an amazing job on everything that he touches. Garrett Lang is the sound engineer. That's honestly, he's too good for me. Athmia Jairam has joined us recently. He's helping us find the best guests to bring onto this podcast. And Ashley Wassilenko helps us organize all this, get people on the schedule, get people's bios, headshots, and really keeps the train on the track. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate all the hard work you do.